Hi everybody, my name is Ronald. I'm the co-founder of About Fraud and I'm the webinar host for this session today. Before we go into all the details, I would like to remind everybody about our one and only housekeeping rule. Please be active, please ask questions. So on the right-hand side of the panel, you can find the chat box where I already made a short comment. That's the place where you can ask your questions or making your comments or making any other statements which you have. So that's the only housekeeping rule. Please be active. Good. Today we talk about OTPs. I mean, everybody knows what is an OTP. Everybody knows there's quite a challenge how to use OTPs in a really secure environment, and also how to make a better customer experience with or without an OTP. So that is the topic of today. We have an interesting panel. So we have Doug from Chartway joining us. We have Matt and Dewald from Entersekt. But I would like to give everybody a short minute to really introduce themselves. Maybe Doug, you can start first. Who you are and what are you doing right now?
Yeah, as you said, I'm Doug, and you can see that on the screen. I work with Chartway Credit Union, and I'm on the digital side. That's the vertical that I run. So we obviously deal a lot with various fraud vectors, hence why I'm here today. And kind of understanding that landscape and how we can better protect our members, but also keep processes really seamless is a big focus kind of my whole team and group.
Thanks, Doug. Thanks for joining the session. Matt, you're the next.
All right. Hey, everybody. Matt Loos, Chief Revenue Officer for Entersekt. And me and my team focus on go-to-market strategy, overall partnerships, and really focus on the growth of the organization and how we effectively distribute product set within financial institutions and other partners like issuer processors and direct to banks and credit unions. So excited to be here today. Thank you.
Thank you, Matt. Last but not least, Dewald.
Hey, everyone. Dewald Nolte, Chief Strategy Officer for Entersekt and also one of the co-founders. So been with the business right from the start. Mostly responsible for market strategies and looking at new product capabilities and how we expand in new territories. And so very excited to be here and look forward to the conversation.
Perfect. So you can see we have a great panel with different perspectives about OTPs. Before we go into all the details about OTPs, we prepared a few slides to show some numbers, why the discussion about OTP is important, and also giving a bit more foundation to define what is an OTP and how that looks. And Dewald will take over from here to build a foundation for everybody in the room.
Sure. Thank you very much, Ronald. And I think to kick it off, we wanted to start with a little bit of market insights. I think one-time passwords or one-time PINs, it goes by both, is a technology that is very, very widely adopted. And certainly we're starting to kind of see the cracks in that armor becoming very visible in the market. If you look at some of these stats, OTP bots on the rise. I think with the introduction of new AI tools, this is becoming a lot more easy. And certainly things like the emergence of bots as a service in OTP fraud is an interesting one that we're kind of starting to see, more happening in the market. Something specifically that we're starting to kind of see emerging is something called SMS pumping. And this is typically where fraudsters use bots that generate fake accounts to automatically input phone numbers into online forms that are then connected to SMS systems that trigger SMS OTPs. And so then they use this to really generate OTP messages and run up your SMS bill and pretty much waste the capacity and of your systems without any, with an illegitimate interaction that actually yields zero results for the FI. So, not a great thing, but certainly starting to see more of that, an interesting kind of attack. And then, of course, I think on the fraud side, unfortunately seeing a lot of rises happening year to year. 43% of FIs report a fraud increase year to year. This is from a recent report that was published by payments.com, and certainly a number of that is not insignificant and cause for concern. 51% of global fraud professionals are reporting that there is an increase in account takeovers, and 59% reporting an increase in online payment fraud. So once again, seeing a consistent rise happening out there. So definitely a problem that we kind of need to respond to in a good way. And I think once again, even when we think about the emergence of real-time payment systems such as Zelle, there once again an area where we're seeing a lot of increases in fraud happening when these services are being used. And then I think last but not least, customers are ready for change to some of the new, more advanced authentication options that are out there that can help us address some of these problems. We're starting to see that nearly half of online shoppers in the US already use things like biometric authentication, and that there is an additional 15% expressing interest to use this in the future. So that's promising that we're kind of starting to see that the consumers are also kind of ready to kind of make the jump to some of these new, more advanced and more secure technologies. So that's interesting to hear. And I think just to level set, I always want to make sure that everyone understands the principle. So if we just look at a one-time password or a one-time passcode, what it is it's typically it's an auto-generated string of alphanumeric characters, and it usually is only valid for a single session. Many times also time-based, right? So you have a certain amount of time to use it, and it's only valid for one session. So in principle, if you think about it, it sounds pretty secure. And what it tries to do essentially is to add another dimension. If you think about the principles of multi-factor authentication, it's an extra layer of security in addition to something like a username and a password, right? Which is a knowledge-based factor. So what an OTP tries to do is to create a possession factor to add to that username and password knowledge factor to then effectively create a multi-factor solution. So one-time password, if you think about it, sending an SMS OTP to your phone, the fact that you are able to receive that on your SIM card and then type that back into the challenge screen is a way to try and prove that you have the SIM card, that possession factor in hand. Or if it's a software token where you generate that you have the software OTP generator in hand. And so that's what an OTP was designed to do. There are many ways to do that. Hardware tokens, software tokens such as Google Authenticator being one example, or then the SMS or email kind of form factors where you can do that on demand, where you don't necessarily need to have a pre-set up capability for that. And these one-time passwords would typically be used for high-risk interactions on your online channel. So where a high-risk interaction happens with one of your clients, and you want to make sure that you're actually speaking to the right person on the other side, that's typically where these one-time passwords would be generated and come into play. Typically use cases as listed here would be account access, right? Or authenticating a payment, or adding a new payee to your account. These are all high-risk interactions where you want to step up the security to make sure that is actually the account holder that you are interacting with that is, initiating this interaction. So I think just as that's the background, I'm hoping that was clear, and that everyone then has a firm grasp about just what OTPs are and why they're being used and what the role for that is. And I think with that in mind, Ronald, I'll pass back to you to perhaps get into the poll. That would be a good time to perhaps launch that.
Yeah, and the poll is very straightforward. It's a yes and no answer. So is your organization using today OTPs? And please take a second to make a choice. So we're going to look into the results in a moment. But maybe one question, Dewald, I don't know if you know, but when was OTP launched? Is there a specific date or year? I mean, I think like a lot of, again, like authentication, multi-factor was driving OTPs a lot, but also OTPs existing already since a long time. And you mentioned an interesting word, it was designed for a certain purpose. But in the meantime, technology became more advanced, fraudsters became more advanced. So maybe the design in the past did not reflect the threat which we have today.
No, absolutely. I think Ronald, what's quite interesting is if you do look at the history of one-time password codes, I think the first implementation of that was actually in the 1990s, towards the end. So prior to the 2000s even, was when this really started to kind of come into play. As an example, in the South African market, one of the markets, where we were founded initially, in the year 2000, all the banks in that region already rolled out one-time passwords on their online banking channels. So it was already fully adopted in the year 2000. And in the year 2008, it was already so broken in that market that, we founded the company to kind of solve that problem. And so certainly something that I perhaps wanted to take you through here is, if you look at how fraud has evolved over time, I think it's really, really important to kind of keep an eye on that. I think fraud is something that evolves over time. It doesn't stay the same, right? It moves and always finds the path of least resistance. And so from that perspective, something that, that I kind of just wanted to take you through here is, if you look back towards the early 2000s, most online platforms would just use username and password, right? So that's like a knowledge factor. So if you think about multi-factor, typically you have 3 form factors. You've got a knowledge factor, something that you know; a possession factor, something that only the user would possess; and then last but not least, an inherence factor, so something that you are, so biometrics would, for example, fall into the inherence factor kind of category. So if you look at this initial kind of where we started out, it was only using knowledge factor, right? So username and password, something that you would know. The problem with that being that it was very, very easy for someone to steal that, right? Get you to enter that into a fake website or something like that. So steal your username and password. The problem with the knowledge factor is you don't know that that's gone, and it can be used at scale from a remote location without your knowledge. And so as that kind of started really with a phishing attack being very successful against just username and password with the knowledge factor, that was when the industry responded with one-time passwords, trying to introduce a possession factor into the equation to make it more secure. Now, why that's important is a possession factor, when it comes to multi-factor principles, is very, very important, because what it achieves when implemented correctly, at least in theory, you actually can remove the attack at scale, because if it's something that only a user has in their possession, then it becomes a very targeted attack. You actually have to attack just one person in order to kind of get their possession factor to get a hold of that. And so your attack at scale is very limited by using a possession factor as part of your multi-factor strategy. The problem is that, of course, the fraudsters are very clever, and the OTPs that we implemented, was something that you kind of re-entered into the channel. And so when OTP was launched, the response from the fraudsters was to launch the man-in-the-middle attack. So they would launch a site, kind of convince a user to go into a site, and then effectively, from that perspective, just convince them to actually enter the OTP as well. And to put that into perspective here, let's say I receive an email from my bank, right, to say, hey, there's been fraud on your account. Just click on this link to update your details so that your account doesn't get shut down. This is a typical email site. The user, trusting that this is from the bank, clicks on the link and is directed to a fake site that is hosted by a fraudster. the user enters their credentials, username and password into this site, and the fraudster kind of uses that to actually enter that into the real banking site. So now they've got your username and your password entered into the real bank. The bank at that stage would say, okay, we want multi-factor, so we want you to enter an OTP, right? So we'll send you a text message, that you have to re-enter or generate on a soft token or hard token. And the problem here is that the user would then re-enter that OTP into the same website, right? And then giving it right back to the fraudster. And of course, now they've got your username, they've got your password, and they have the one-time passcode. And that means they're in and can do whatever they want. And so this is the problem, right? The man-in-the-middle attack. If you're re-entering anything into the into that primary channel, you're still going to be vulnerable to this kind of attack. And so the response to that was to say, well, let's do out-of-band authentication, right? So we're going to push a challenge to the user in real time to ask them, hey, is this what you want to do? Straight to their mobile phone as an example, and the user responds directly back from their phone directly to the bank. So there's no re-entering of a one-time password into this channel where the fraudster can wait for you. And of course, the prompt to the consumer would also have the context of the transaction, so the consumer would know, hey, this isn't what I was trying to do. If the fraudster initiated a strange or an unwanted transaction. Was very successful, worked very well for some time until the fraudsters kind of adapted once again to say, okay, well, if you're going to do that, we're going to call the consumer or the account holder and tell them that, hey, you're going to receive this prompt to your phone. Just say yes. Please just say yes. So don't read it. Don't worry about it. And so this vishing attack is one at the moment, for example, that's very prevalent across the globe in most of the territories that we are operating. And so once again, here, some of the defenses that you can do around that is, using more context like proximity and facial recognition, liveness, things like that. Those are all things that you can really kind of apply to combat this. But I think the one that's pretty much now on the rise that's a bit more complex is the fact that now they're even going towards payer manipulation, where an attacker actually convinces the account holder to transfer money from their own account. And so if you think about account defenses, that becomes quite difficult, because now it is the actual account holder logging into their own account and paying money from their own accounts. And so you can imagine that's a very difficult one to protect against. And the only thing that I kind of wanted to just show here is not to do fear mongering, but to kind of more show that fraud evolves. And if you look at something like SMS OTP, you can see this is actually something that is quite far back in terms of the types of attacks that we're already seeing in the market, and that it is something that you have to constantly invest and evolve with if you want to truly keep your clients secure and protected. And so that's kind of just the message here that I wanted to share to kind of get the conversation started.
Yeah, thanks, Dewald, for this overview. I think it's fantastic. And I also shared in the chat the results of the poll, and we can see how relevant this topic is, because 76% of everybody who joined the survey said yes. So 76% of the attendees said yes, I'm using OTPs. And I think that's interesting, because you mentioned OTPs already in place for quite some time, and in between we already had some steps of evolution, but it looks that a certain amount of FIs are still in this kind of, let's say, OTP phase right now. But maybe the question to Doug, to kick off the conversation, why do you think, Doug, that FIs still running OTPs if they know that OTPs have a challenge or a higher risk attached?
That's a good question. So I think, in this context too, right, when we look at this, the age of OTPs as a technology, right? I don't know what the stat was earlier. It was like 2006 was like the first, like, we're rocking and rolling with it, right? And so if you fast forward to now, when you think about all of your platforms as an FI, right, this is like easy integrated technology, right? This is not a new age fintech, something that's going to go bring you all kinds of stuff. It's there, it's ready to go. And I think there's an element of this as at least in my perspective from a financial institution, where as these fraud attacks have evolved, we also have seen like an evolution in customers, right? Like customers are becoming more used to certain fraud attacks. And so OTP works, right? And it's easy. It may not be the best solution, right? And it allows, so when you ask the question of why do 76% of us still use this, there's an element of this where it does work to a degree, and it's less and less effective every year, but it's been very easy and it's integrated in many systems. And I think that's really why there's like a lag in this. We're reaching a threshold, I think, right now. I know you have the "we are here" Dewald, and I think we're at a point where it's like everyone is very conscious now of sort of the outdated nature of OTP as a technology, and the ease of use is not that easy because it doesn't give you the bang for your buck that you're really looking for.
No, certainly. And I think perhaps something to add to that, Doug, is the fact that, I think something like OTP and the use of that is actually also a quite an important, step and realization, right? Moving from something like only username and password to something like the use of OTPs is already a very, positive step in the fact that the bank is already recognizing the fact that multi-factor authentication, right, a higher step up of the security of the consumer is a requirement, right? And I think so it certainly is a very, very important step. And of course, I think it sets you up when these gates are in place, where you actually, do the increase of the security for your clients. I think it's very important that it is in place there, and then gives you the opportunity to also then evolve using some of the more advanced tools that are now available. And even, when it comes to user experience, to have that baseline of, there are certain things that will require the consumer to jump through an extra hoop, and that then kind of, really kind of enables you to manage that user experience and even improve it, right, with some of the new technologies that are available for that.
And I just want to I saw a comment from Joel. Everybody is using it because everyone has a phone and a way to receive OTP. And I think that, sums up sort of the ease of use case for OTP and why it's persisted.
Yeah, maybe just one additional note there, which when we're engaging with financial institutions, and this is maybe for more of that downstream market, the smaller FIs, excuse me, what we're seeing typically on some of these FIs that actually haven't really gotten burnt and haven't had significant loss related to these type of activities yet, they don't really understand or haven't educated themselves on kind of what's to come and preparing themselves and future-proofing for the risks that are going to inevitably come their way. So I think there's maybe, for certain segments of the market, a false sense of security and thinking, hey, we haven't been hit, OTPs are okay, we're in good position for the time being, and we've got 15 other priorities that we've got to tackle with resource constraints. So this one's kind of down on the list. So it's something that we really do on a daily basis on my team is educating them on what these risks are and how to be prepared for what's coming, and ultimately talking about some of the market dynamics and the evolution of what's coming their way if it hasn't already.
Maybe another question to Doug. I mean, at the end, as Dewald mentioned, everything is changing all the time, but we cannot change the experience of our customers all the time because it's quite a long tail of customers, and really getting to everybody and explaining what to do now and what to do tomorrow is quite some effort. So how much is this important? Again, back to Joel's comment, everybody's a phone, everybody's used to OTPs. So by changing it, because it's so convenient, so how much is this relevant in a bank or in an FI to really make this kind of balancing act? Okay, we want to have a secure process, but also we want to have really this kind of convenient easy to use process for our customers.
Yeah, so I think that balancing act is one any FI is walking, right? Is like our user experience, and the fraudsters to some degree are preying on that, right? Like they know that we need a good user experience, and that opens up certain avenues potentially. And so one of the things I think we think of at Chartway, right, is, and when you think about fraud and people that experience fraud, when you're looking at setting up a more sophisticated and potentially more gates, right? More friction in the user experience. You don't necessarily need to take away the phone, like if we use Joel's comment, right? As like, we can still leverage the phone to do that. And we can still do things in our application that keeps it fairly seamless. But one thing I know we've looked at is when, and this dovetails kind of on, if you're a small FI and you're not experiencing a ton of fraud, that's awesome. I hope that continues forever. I just want to say that. But as you start to experience fraud, one of the biggest, I think, champions of new fraud processes is to open up a new security vet, like if you're using something that's not OTP, to the people that have actually had fraud on their accounts, right? And those people see the new process, and it's much more, they realize and they champion it for you, right? They're going to test it and tell you the kind of things that bother them, that they like, the security elements of it that they like. And I think you really have to engage with your end users that have experienced fraud, and then you'll kind of find the user experience that's somewhere in between. Because I will say, with our people that have experienced fraud, I mean, if I told them your account's never going to get compromised again if you do this, they would do any gate, anything that they could do, right? Now, that's not everyone. And so that's an extreme. But from my perspective, that's one of the ways we really look at it, is that people are willing to take a little bit more intense user experience, more gates, if that value proposition is there and it's not so intrusive that it's changing everything that they're doing. It's just changing one facet of what they're doing.
Yeah, and Doug, maybe one of the things, and I saw Joel's new comment here as well, and I think it kind of plays into that a little bit. One of the things that we've seen that kind of works quite well, we kind of call it context-aware authentication, right? Is where you really kind of in real time are able to take into account a number of aspects and risk signals at the point of authentication in the user journey, and then really kind of make an assessment based on the risk there to see what's the most appropriate way to challenge the customer that you're interfacing with. And I think what's interesting about that specifically is when your platform has a number of different ways to be able to challenge a customer if required. Something that's worked quite well is where we have the ability to also get the consumer's input, right? To get them to capture their preference for authentication. Okay, so why is that important, right? So if you think, I always take the example of, okay, here's my mobile phone, right? If I were to look at the way that I set up my phone, the way that my phone is laid out, right, where I put my apps. If I were to hand my phone to you, Doug, and I asked you to do something on my phone, you would probably have quite a hard time, right, to actually find your way around. Where's this app? Where's that app?
Definitely.
And exactly, right. And the reason for that is just personal preference when it comes to consumer experience is actually such a big thing, right? Because we might have exactly the same device, but the way that our preferences kind of, are, that means that we set up that in a very different way. And so having the ability to take into account consumer preference about how they're being challenged is actually quite important in terms of user experience and success rates. And so we've seen where we're able to actually take that into account when we do challenge the clients, that the consumer experience when it comes to that is much more positive because, from a consumer's point of view, you're being challenged in the way that you prefer. And second of all, so those success rates then actually are much higher. And specifically, I think when it comes to payment use cases, we see that plays a big role, right? Because typically in those cases, when you're doing a payment, many times you're kind of in a hurry, or you kind of just want to get it done. And so from those perspectives, being able to leverage the authentication method of choice, the preference of the user, really has seen really positive results for us. And from that perspective, because it's the choice of the consumer, a lot of the consumer training, right, that many banks are very nervous about, what's the impact going to be on user experience, kind of goes out the window, because the consumer kind of have the power to kind of set it up in the way that they like to be challenged. And so that's been something that we have seen has been very positively received by consumers when it comes to this.
Okay, maybe another angle. I mean, Dewald and Matt, you are working with customers around the world, and often the fraud type depends on the region, or when the fraud comes, maybe delays in other regions. Is there anything right now which you see interesting in one part of the world, which is maybe not active right now in the US? Again, the biggest part of audience today is from the US. Maybe we can do like looking into the future. What are maybe Dewald one or two use cases where you see, based on your history and insights into other markets, or potential threats which potentially are around the corner?
Sure. I think that's a very interesting question, and certainly a very relevant one. We definitely see quite a number of different profiles when it goes from one region to the next. Certainly, if you think about just the regulatory kind of environment, or you look at the infrastructure options in a country, a lot of these things can play into what that looks like. And so you see very different attack vectors and very different preferences from FIs in these different regions because of that. So one example that I'll give you is, we use the example here of SMS one-time passwords, right? I'll just give that example. So in the year 2000 in South Africa, for example, that was adopted by all the banks. In the year 2008, SMS OTP in that country was so broken that we came up with a new solution in that market, which was the out-of-band push to the app, which was adopted from 2009, 2010, kind of going forward there. In 2011, a US company won an innovation award for SMS OTP in the US, right? And so just to kind of give an example of that lag. And so what we're kind of seeing is that in many cases, the emerging markets where your infrastructure, for example, is not necessarily as mature as some of the first world markets, what you'll find is in those countries, FIs are perhaps forced to adopt technology much earlier than some of the first world markets, right? So I'll take the example of, in Nigeria as an example, the banking infrastructure or the branches might not necessarily be as mature as in the US. And so if you want to open a bank account, but you're 200 miles away from the nearest bank branch, good luck with that, right? I mean, you're not going to be very successful as a bank unless you're able to leverage the fact that everyone has a mobile phone. And so again, very early, that was something that had to be adopted there. And so because of that being adopted earlier, of course, some of the attacks for those channels then start to happen in those territories much earlier. And so what we found is that, we really see in some of these markets, some of the attacks much, much earlier than in other markets. And then there's almost like the cycle, right? It starts in certain of these emerging markets that have early adoption of new technology. And then over time, it kind of finds its way to the more mature markets when it's actually eventually adopted there. And what's good about that is it does give us the ability to kind of really understand and solve for it before it really becomes a problem in some of the other markets. But I'll give you one example. I saw that Leslie, for example, mentioned, are you checking for risk on the phone, before the transaction, as an example. A recent one that we saw now is, so in one of our territories, we would always, for every single transaction that you do that's high risk, we would, for example, look at a SIM swap, right? So before you actually send the SMS OTP, look for a SIM swap to make sure that, when you send this SMS OTP, you're going to actually send it to the correct number. So a fraudster hasn't performed a SIM swap and effectively performed an account takeover on the mobile phone number, and then when you send that OTP as the bank, it actually goes to the fraudster's phone. And so, that works quite well because now you can see, oh, there was a SIM swap here, and then that's a risk signal that can help you from the FI side, make a decision to send an SMS one-time password or not. Recently, we saw in one of the territories that, the fraudsters kind of caught up to this, and they got someone in the telco, so man in the operator attack. And so what they do is they would literally wait until the SIM swap check has been done, and then hold on to the SMS OTP. And so after the SIM swap has been checked, they would actually then swap the number and then only release the SMS OTP, because SMS is a store and forward technology. So it can be kind of, held on to, for example, and before it's released out to the phone. And so those are then things to say, okay, well, now we have to think about when we actually do the SIM swap check before, because the timing of that might actually be quite important. So that's, for example, one of the things that we're seeing in some of the, the other territories that, hasn't necessarily come to the US just yet. I know SIM swap fraud here is starting to kind of, start to emerge in this market as well. I don't think it's as prevalent as some of the other ones. As I mentioned, in some of our other territories, you literally have to do that for every single transaction, whether payments or just login. And so that's actually quite an important one. Something else might be, where we see the rise of vishing fraud, right? And that's starting to get quite prevalent here in the US. Just to talk about one that's, quite relevant here, where, as I mentioned earlier, the fraudster would actually call the account holder and convince them to give them to either read the OTP to them, or if it's a push to the app, to say yes. And so, these clients are being manipulated. And so in those cases, once again, we're working and then we've seen this kind of attack happen in other territories long before it actually started to happen here. And working with banks to make sure that we have good enough signals to actually feed into their risk engines, and to make sure that you actually can see across more than one channel, because that's a big attack that we start to see really in the industry now, is that if you have siloed kind of implementations inside the bank, that fraudsters would use multiple channels to actually target a single one. And that's a big problem. And so you have to be able to, for example, set up a system that can actually feed back context between the different channels to pick up these multi-channel attacks. And that's quite important to combat something like these VoIP or these social engineering attacks. And so I think these are all things that we do see happen in other territories, specifically where the lack of infrastructure forces earlier adoption of some of these technologies earlier. And then that's something that really kind of helps us to kind of keep ahead of the curve and really, come up with solutions to work with banks to actually then make sure that we can protect the other clients in the other territories with technologies that are already proven in these other territories.
Yeah, spot on, Dewald. And a couple of the comments there. One is, it's interesting to see that migration pattern, and I think we've got a good pulse on kind of what that looks like. And I would say not only from our experience, but from some of our partnerships that we have in the US, holistically, what we're seeing is that we're kind of at a fever pitch right now. Like, it's here, it's happening, the risk is real. So we're starting to see, digital banking providers that are engaging with us saying, hey, how do we get out in front of this? Like, what does this look like from if we were to plug technology in and holistically be able to authenticate in a different way? But even beyond that, card brands and credit bureaus and a lot of fintechs out there are now looking at this as, okay, how do we share data to mitigate this problem? How do we bring data consortia to a point where industry-wide we can attack this? So, we certainly saw that in other regions, and now we're absolutely seeing that in the US as well. So very much a key indicator.
Maybe now Doug thinks, oh my God, what do? I get all these topics around the corner. I mean, it's a good question, Doug, because in a bank, normally change takes time and you need to think ahead. Where's the fraud maybe in 12 months or 24 months? So what do you do, Doug, now? How are you preparing for 24, 25?
That's a huge question. And yeah, I'm panicked. No, I'm not. I'm calm. I'm still calm. Well, so I think it's kind of twofold, right? Like, yes, we know there's going to be future fraud vectors, right, that are going to happen, and they're going to be more and more unique. And staying ahead of it from an industry perspective, it certainly helps to have partners or whoever. Like Entersekt is a good example. You guys are in markets that maybe demonstrate some of the future stuff. But being involved in anything like this, these kinds of calls, that kind of stuff, just to kind of get an understanding, I think is important. But I do really think that one of the things you have to start with is understanding your current fraud and really the impact to your organization. And then from there, you start to say, what are the things we truly need to mitigate and what are we protected against now and moving forward? And I also think when you do that, when you set that like base context of where you stand from a fraud perspective, you also need to build a good communication loop. I think Dewald talked about different sections of an organization, right? And the different ways those parts of the organization connect to each other, and sort of some of the holes or ways that fraudsters can manipulate one section against another section, whether it's technology or people or whatever. But one of the biggest things for me, I think, and I'll get to the point, is fraudsters are always trying to come up with creative ways to impact your organization. Having a good communication loop in your organization as these things start to occur is huge for trying to prepare for what you might need in the future. And it really understand, and from a data perspective too, I mean, like, I might not be impacted by a vishing scheme, right? And so maybe I'm concerned with that, but it's not my number one fraud concern. There's a different one that I'm more focused on. And until you start, first building a context of the fraud you're experiencing, understanding it from a data perspective, can you really start planning? Because I can't plan for all fraud. I would bankrupt. I think no one would listen to me if I said we should plan for all the fraud on the planet, right? But you can hyper focus on the things that are impacting you today, and then maybe how those breaches will open you up to future fraud and how you can prepare for that. But without understanding that context, it's tough to really even get there. So I know I didn't answer like how I'm doing that right now. I think a communication loop is one of our biggest ways that we're looking at it. And when we look at fraud in the future, is I want real time. Like if they're trying to breach our call center, I want to know from the call center rep. I want those calls. I want that connected to our fraud and data points associated with it to understand really what the fraudsters are doing beyond just sort of like the, amorphous fraud exists in the universe and will exist everywhere, right? Hopefully does that make sense? I feel like I said a lot and hopefully it made sense.
I think, again, it's one perspective and everybody needs to think internally. What are my weak points right now? How's the structure? How big is my organization? And also even getting access to the call center is for some companies not easy, to getting really this kind of first line insights, and even many companies struggling to flag the fraud in the right way. Because again, otherwise you don't have the data if you don't flag the fraud with the right flags. And again, we know it's evolving all the time, so we need to educate everybody to really understand and differentiate the different fraud types. Maybe that's another angle, Doug. Maybe there are some practitioners here around us who might just getting started, or who might just really in the session right now and learning. So besides to the communication, is there any kind of low-hanging fruit where you would say, start with these points to really prepare yourself?
Yeah. So and I get that, right? Like maybe I can't get the call center data, or maybe I can't get the whatever data, right? I think from my perspective, the easiest way to start is usually you're able to quantify sort of your bottom line balance sheet impact, right? I paid this much out in fraud for these compromised accounts that money got transferred out of, or whatever it is. And if you start there, you now quantify sort of, and I'm biased because I'm at a financial institution, right? We care about, not that any institution doesn't, but we're very hyper-focused on our bottom line. Most businesses are. And from both education and understanding perspective, when you speak in financial terms that this is our bottom line impact, people listen like immediately. They're like, oh, you've quantified an impact to our bottom line. And then as you start to look at where fraud comes from, you can start to address like, all right, if we spend time and energy figuring out how to get call center data to track and understand fraud, I could mitigate some of this fraud impact by 5%, right? And now suddenly you start to get support because people want to impact that, right? It's for the good of the business, and you can empirically sort of prove that. And I'm using the call center. There's a lot of different data sources you can use, obviously. But I think that initial buy-in, in my experience, has been quantify it financially, and then you start to look at other things. And if you've got the quantification financially, another good one is member, like in our case, we measure our member happiness, right? So when members experience fraud, that, deteriorates some of their happiness, their trust in your organization. That's a quantifiable number we have. That's another easy one to say. Members' lives just become easier if we tackle this subject, right? And try and get more information and more description on what's actually happening with this fraud so that maybe we can mitigate it. I think that's kind of if you're just starting out, I would start with that kind of impact and then start to address different places you might learn more to then address the fraud in a truly mechanical way, like a way where you're impacting it.
Maybe a question to Dewald and to Matt. I mean, you pointed out in a few slides a lot of challenges, but what are the recommendations from your angle, how NFI actually could go ahead of the curve, or at least, let's say, matching or stepping up to the current threats which are out there?
Yeah, I'll take that first. I would say, I think there's the obvious ones of educate yourself and educate your key stakeholders within your institution on what's coming and what's in front of us right now. I would recommend, if you're using a digital banking provider, engage with them, talk to them about, some of the hurdles that you're seeing and some of the needs that you have. And I think that's always a good, very positive conversation because for an institution that's using a digital banking provider, they're really the linchpin to this whole thing from a digital footprint standpoint. I would say the other thing is that, there's other dominoes that fall from a very productive view of efficiency within your institution. If you were to incorporate some different approaches to how you authenticate, there's ways to drive efficiencies on call center interaction and resources that are required of your bank or credit union by way of incorporating new protocols. So there's a lot of a solid view of return on investment, not just risk mitigation. So there's other ways to positively impact your organization. You got to keep a view on kind of that macro level. And we engage with our clients quite a bit on what that looks like and helping them understand where this can navigate to other groups within their organization. So I would say those would be the big ones from my standpoint, and Dewald, love to hear your context as well.
Yeah, sure. And I think, to kind of, just, I think, reinforce something that Doug kind of highlighted is, at the end of the day, the numbers matter, right? Like at the end of the day, the financials are really important, right? For bottom lines, right? For the banks and for the FIs, right? I think at the end of the day, that will obviously help you kind of drive, where your priorities are. And I think if you really kind of look at that, and you apply kind of the 80-20 rule, right? Like, so kind of understanding where you can get the big wins, right? Then that's one thing to kind of keep in mind, is to say, if we focus on solving this problem, right? So to kind of do approach this in a bite-sized, very, very structured way. And that's something that we typically do with our clients, and many times when we engage, FIs that have these problems, to say, well, we don't have to solve all these problems at once, right? Let's look at the ones that are going to give you the best bang for buck in the short term, right? And then we plot this journey for you over time. And as we understand this journey for you as an FI, we can, to Matt's point, really drive efficiencies to say, if we keep in mind that, we're going to start, for example, on, online banking login. I'm just taking an example here. We're going to start on improving your experiences for online banking login. But if we really think about this in the right way and we design it in the right way, hey, this will already set you up for your call center and for your e-commerce channel as well. And so we don't have to do that right now, but the foundation's there. And so adding and addressing those problems in the future is going to be much, much easier to do because of this initial step that you've taken. And I think understanding that journey for an FI is actually quite important. And so that's something that we find actually to be very important, is to make sure that when we do engage with a client, that we really kind of understand and work with them, because it looks different from one FI to the next. It really is a very I think personal things from one organization to the next. And so really working with the FI to understand where they are in their journey and what's important for them in the short term. It might be that, as Ronald, you took the Doug, you took the call center, right, as the initial example, right, to say might be that your biggest pain point is there. Okay, so we're going to start there. But then once again, if we really understand the journey, we can already lay the foundations for very quick and easy follow-ons for some of the other channels, and putting some of these advanced signals in place to protect you in future. And I think that's the thing here, is you really have to kind of understand that bigger picture and then customize that for your journey. Because I think this is the thing that probably we all saw here today, is that fighting fraud is unfortunately a journey. It's not a pit stop. You don't put something in place and then your problems are solved for the next 20 years. Unfortunately, it is something that constantly evolves, and you have to kind of keep kind of staying on top and ahead of it. And that's something that then, as you plan your journey, it really kind of helps you to kind of stay ahead and make sure that the areas where you are exposed the most, that you're ready to address those in a timely fashion to protect your customers.
We got a question from Ryan, and maybe Doug can take this. The big tech companies like Google, Apple, Amazon, they also play in this game as well. Do you think, Doug, they're going to change the landscape, or is even for you something to consider, or how would you deal with this kind of topics?
Yeah, I don't think anybody on planet Earth can ignore Google, Apple, and Amazon when they do things. And I mean that jokingly, Ryan, and I also mean that like very legitimately, right? Like that is something that you always are kind of concerned with, because if tomorrow Google introduced a new authentication method that no one had to use, or no one had used ever before, and everyone started using it and it was effective, the expectation changes for your customer base, right? So that can be both bad and good depending on the kind of process that any of those sort of big players in the tech industry go off of. But fortunately, I think those three, in the context of this conversation, I think those three companies are really going in the direction we're talking about. And that's really positive, I think, from a financial institution perspective, because sometimes we have friction because we're a financial institution and we're like, we really got to protect this more than someone's, Apple ID or whatever. Not now, Apple ID is so intrinsic to life, maybe not. But my point with that is there's an element where we have things that we build gates for. And I think those three organizations are doing things that are kind of in line with that. So when we look at customer sentiment and the way that authentication is happening, because they're going in that direction, it's advantageous. It's an advantageous time as a financial institution to start implementing some of that same sort of technology as it relates to how customers authenticate. That's kind of my perception, I think, of it.
Yeah, and perhaps if I can add something to that, Ronald, I think it is, as Doug says, quite a positive thing. I think you on the back of that, if you look at just the trend over the last couple of years, something like using biometrics, right, has become so just it's just integrated in your life so much in your day-to-day interaction with your phone that becomes the expectation of the consumer. And so where typically from the bank's point of view, you would need to go through the customer education of that. Now that is something that, is already very, very well known and understood by the clients. You can leverage that. The one thing that I've seen kind of with the platforms like that is that you got to watch out for effectively outsourcing your security or the binding of your account and the security to a third party. I think that's one of the things that I would just typically warn against when it comes to FIs. If you think about the attack that we spoke about earlier for a SIM swap, the challenge with a security operation like that and trusting a third party to effectively manage the connection between a security token and the token itself, if that's outsourced to a different company, when they change that, you wouldn't know. So for example, if someone performed a SIM swap, the bank is just trusting that this number is linked to Dewald. When someone changes that relationship, the bank wouldn't know that. They still trust that that is in place. And so while I think the big companies like Google, Apple, Amazon, these platforms will play a big role in terms of what's expected by clients, also enabling new technologies like biometrics. I know the FIDO passkey capabilities, for example, those are things that when these devices support it, and they now do, are very positive things and things that the FIs can leverage. I think you got to take what's good about that and still make sure that your basic principles, where you as the bank still are in control of the relationship between your account holder and what's being used as an authentication mechanism, that relationship remains with you. Otherwise, when you completely trust blindly a relationship that's managed by a different company, you're going to make yourself open for some surprises. And so I think that's just something to keep in mind in terms of that, I guess.
I think it's important about parties, but of course, especially smaller banks, even bigger banks, working with a lot of third parties. So that's why it's a kind of a risk of the business to deal with parties. And we're already running close to the hour. I think we are good from a timing point. We got good questions. We got some good perspective. I don't know if someone has a last maybe hint or something to share. Otherwise, I would close the call. Doug, Matt, Dewald, any kind of final comment?
Yep, all good here. Thank you.
Perfect. Then thank you, Doug, for joining. Thank you, Matt. Thank you, Dewald, for being here. Thanks for all the insights. I hope we gave the audience some good perspective, some good ideas to maybe thinking ahead and getting really into the topic. And again, everybody, if you have more questions, please reach out to the speakers. I'm just going to share again like the slide. You can see the names. So please connect. Again, it's all about connection, all about sharing insights. And yeah, thank you for being here today and have a nice day.
Thank you.
Thank you, everybody.
Thanks.